All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start Unit 7. This PowerPoint is very, very long. So Ms. Nesbitt and I are actually going to split it up into two. Hopefully, we won't do it in three, but this first part's going to get you all the way up to 1919. As you can tell by the title, which is blocked by my taskbar here, it is Global Conflict 1900 to the Present. Unit 7 is basically World War One, a little bit after World War One, and then World War Two, and then Unit 8 is going to be Cold War, and then Unit 9 is going to be after that. So it's all of this time period, and a lot of it kind of melts into one another. So bear with us. We've got a lot to tell you. All right. We know there's a lot of shifting power happening right now. The West was dominating global politics at the start of the 20th century. Remember all those older land based empires we've talked about? They're going to collapse. The Ottoman Empire is going to basically consolidate and fall into what is now today Turkey. The Qing Empire is going to become the Republic of China, and Russia is going to become the USSR. So the Ottomans, Turkey kind of comes around in 1923, the Republic of China is 1911, and the USSR is in 1917. We'll get into all the revolutions that occur and make all these things possible. Ottoman Empire on the left, all the green is where you can see what it used to look like, how much land it actually took up. You can see all the countries that it took over. And on the right, you can see Turkey. That's all it is now. That's all that they have left is Turkey. So for a long time, they owned a lot of land. And now it's just Turkey. Just nice to have a visual on that. So we've got a lot of shifting power. The balance of power from the Congress of Vienna is starting to break down. So let's kind of refresh about Congress of Vienna. This was a meeting that took place between 1814 and 1815. And the purpose was to bring all these countries together to make a long-term peace plan for Europe. But around this time, it's going to start to fall apart. States are going to be challenged by existing political structures, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Mexican Revolution and then go into the Russian Revolution. So let's start with the Mexican Revolution. Started around 1910, ends around 1920. So we've got this dictator, Porfirio Diaz, and he has ruled for 31 years, and he starts to crumble. There's a lot of poor treatment of the people. Basically, there's really, really rich, and there's really, really poor, and there's no one in between, which is always going to cause a problem. So Francisco Madera is going to challenge him in 1910 in a presidential election. The results are rigged. So Diaz wins. Therefore, this causes an uprising, and Madera and all these others are going to revolt. And Madera's got Pancho Villa on his side and Emiliano Zapata. Please keep that name in mind, Zapata, because he's going to show up a little bit later. All right, there's an armed conflict, and eventually Diaz is actually forced out, and the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez is signed. Therefore, we are going to hold new elections, and Madero becomes the president in 1911. So he's the president, everything's going really, really well, but then the conservatives see him as weak and too liberal, and the revolutionary fighters who used to fight with him see him as too conservative. Basically, the guy couldn't win. So we're going to have this event in February of 1913, known as the 10 Tragic Days, where he and his vice president were forced to resign and both were assassinated. So this guy, General Victoriano Huerta, he's actually backed by the US ambassador. He comes to power February of 1913. But by July of 1914, he is forced out by revolutionaries. So we're going to end up with all these revolutionaries not quite agreeing. You got Carranza, you have Villa, you have Zapata. Just a little note here, they end up with a civil war in 1914 to 1915. So there's a constitutional faction led by Venustiano Carranza, and they win out. So Carranza is the one that's going to win. He defeats the other revolutionaries. And remember that Zapata guy I told you to keep a note of? He's actually assassinated in 1919 by agents of President Carranza. Sorry. So we end up getting a new constitution under Carranza, which had democracy, education, agrarian reform, and labor rights. He actually remains in office until Alvaro Obregón Salido takes office in 1920 to 1924. Side note, you don't have to know for the AP exam, but it's always fun to know these little side notes. Obregon was reelected in 1928. However, someone that was offended by the country's anti-religious laws decides to assassinate him in that same year. And as you can see, Zapata was assassinated in 1919. I talked to you about that. And Vila was killed in 1923. Members of the PRI, that political party, though, actually maintained the presidency until the year 2000. Not too shabby. So we've talked a little bit about this in class. If you've ever seen the movie Anastasia, I know it's a cartoon, but kind of hints this whole thing that was going on. The Russian Revolution, and I know in class we've talked about it here and there, and I've told you, spoiler alert, and most of you know this. If you've taken some type of world history before, you are familiar with it. So we know that the last Tsar was Nicholas II. He was, near the end, too conservative, and the masses wanted liberal reforms. Because remember, Russia was really the last to get industrialized when it comes to these great powers. So a lot of other countries were, doing all these great things, and the people of Russia are like, why aren't we there yet? So they're going to have some problems that are going to start the spark of the Russian Revolution. The first one, of course, is the loss in the Russo-Japanese War, which took place between 1904 and 1905. The deal was Russia wanted a warm water port in the Pacific for their navy and their trade. Meanwhile, Japan was fearing that Russia would encroach on their plans for a sphere of influence because they know that Russia has been trying to expand since the 1500s. So Japan wants to make a deal and offers to recognize Manchuria as Russia's possession if Russia recognizes Japan's sphere of influence over Korea. They figured if we kind of agree, there won't be any fighting. However, Russia refuses, so Japan sees this as a threat and decides to go to war. They do a surprise attack, and Russia consequently keeps getting defeated. Tsar Nicholas II is convinced they will actually win, so he keeps fighting. But then even later, he just doesn't want to concede. So he just keeps fighting and fighting and fighting. Japan even said at one point they would do an armistice, but Russia said no because of their pride. It was actually Teddy Roosevelt who mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended it all. So, now, Bloody Sunday happens in 1905. This is when unarmed demonstrators were fired upon by the soldiers of the Imperial Guard as they marched towards the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas. This, of course, is going to provoke public outrage. This will be the start of the Revolution of 1905, which were strikes, mutinies, peasant unrest, but that resulted in the Russian Constitution, the Duma, and the multi-party system. We talked about that in class, but as we all know, it was too little, too late. Bloody Sunday, though, is known as one of the key events which led to the Russian Revolution of 1917. So the problems that are going to stir, we've got a lot of rationing that's just because of the World War that's going to happen. World War I, of course, back then it's known as the Great War, which is going to lead to starvation. The war was unpopular. Nicholas II is leading for the war front, and Rasputin's influence is going to begin. He's basically infiltrated the family, and nobody really likes that. So now we have the February Revolution of 1917, also known as the February Bourgeoisie Democratic Revolution. So this takes place in the capital. Discontent with the monarchy over rationing of the food is what's like leading this charge. So there's these mass demonstrations, violent armed clashes with the police, and all of a sudden the mutinous Russian army actually sides with the revolutionaries on February 27th. Just a side note here. It was February 27th on the old calendar because we used to use the Julian calendar, but we switched to the Gregorian calendar in 1918. So you will see what is known as old dates and new dates. So it was February 27th on the old calendar. It's March 12th on the new calendar. Side note, not on the AP exam, but always fascinating. So Tsar Nicholas actually abdicates 3 days later. He's like, okay, fine, the people have spoken, I'm out. They have a new government under this guy named Prince Grigory Lvov, and it's basically a republic government. So the new government's mostly Russian nobles. The majority of the Russia people, though, were peasants and industrial workers. So that's going to pave the way for this charismatic lawyer named Vladimir Lenin to come on in and change the course of history. So between 1918 and 1921, we have the two groups, the Reds, which are the Bolsheviks, versus the Whites, which are the Royalists, the monarchists, the militarists, and even for the beginning of time, it was the foreign nations, because these foreign nations wanted to stop Russia's ability to consolidate and take all this power. But of course, the Reds win, furthering the Bolsheviks' authoritarian tendencies. So the new economic policy during the war, if you're growing a bunch of food, the war communism was you, the farmer, would grow 10 tons of it. The government's going to take all the surplus, like 9 tons, and you're left with a ton. Not not great, but under Lenin, after the war, he's like, okay, cool. You've grown 10 tons. The government takes 50. You go off and sell 4 of that, and you're left with 1 ton to feed your family, plus a bunch of cash. So his plan actually allows for some private ownership and limited foreign investment to stimulate the economy. The two revolutions that you really want to look at, this is why we discuss them, and you want to be able to compare them, are the Mexican Revolution and the Russian Revolution. In the Mexican Revolution, some industries actually were nationalized. This started prior to World War I, and of course the results were a constitution, an elected government that's in power. In the Russian Revolution, we have communism. It was in reaction to World War I, and the result was an authoritarian government. Now, what they both have in common is they both intended to benefit the lower class. They both challenged the state authority. Of course, you have Diaz's dictatorship, that he was in power for 31 years, versus the Tsar's empire in Russia. And the first replacement government, of course, was ineffective. You have Madero, that falls apart, and then the provisional government in Russia. So it's good to know this comparison, especially when we start getting into LEQs. All right, now, finally into World War I. This is it. Here we go. Here we go. I'm excited. Here's where it gets complicated. All right. Okay, so I had to actually go grab some of my extra notes for this because it just gets that complicated. When people are asked what started World War I, we tend to say when Gavrilo Princip, the Bosnian Serb living in Bosnia-Herzegovina, wants to end Austria-Hungary rule, shoots Franz Ferdinand, the Austrian Archduke. Okay, fine. That would be the spark that starts World War I. But there's a lot of other pieces that go into this. So Gavrilo Princip was a member of the Black Hand. The Black Hand, of course, formed because they were mad that the Serbian government allowed Austria-Hungary to take Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnia-Herzegovina technically used to be owned, essentially, by the Ottoman Empire. Now, the taking of Bosnia-Herzegovina under Austria-Hungary is known as the Bosnian Crisis, right here, taken over in 1908. Technically, Austria-Hungary had been managing Bosnia-Herzegovina since the Congress of Berlin in 1878. So even though in name Bosnia-Herzegovina was owned by the Ottomans, Austria was actually running things. So it gets really kind of messy. Now, the Congress of Berlin was a meeting to keep the peace. As you could tell, we have a lot of those. This is a meeting between Russia, Great Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and four of the Balkan states: Greece, Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro. So, as we know, the Ottoman Empire is starting to fall apart a long, long time ago, but it's crumbling over the years. And we talked about the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire, and they're revolting. So the foreign minister of Austria-Hungary sees this as his chance to take over officially over Bosnia-Herzegovina. So when they do, this will make the Slavs very angry. And the Slavs are this Slavic population that live there. Now, the deal is the Slavic population in Bosnia-Herzegovina actually want to make their own nation. And in Serbia, there are Slavs there that want to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina because they're like, we want you to join us. We want all of our people to be together. So Ottomans have fallen apart. The Austrian Hungaries are going to take over the Bosnia-Herzegovinas. The Russians are weak because we've already talked about the Russo-Japanese War, the fight over Manchuria and Korea and all of that, and Japan wins. So the Russians, they want power in the Balkans. Of course, remember the Crimean War? They're always trying to get their foot in the door. So as a result of all this, they encourage pro-Russian, anti-Austrian sentiment in Serbia. Now over here, after the Bosnian crisis in January of 1909, the chief of staff of the Austrian army goes to the German counterpart and says, hey, would you have our back if we invade Serbia and Russia gets involved? And the Germans say, yeah, we got you. No problem. So you also want to know about all these other little things. We have the Triple Alliance of 1882, where Germany and Austria-Hungary were friends actually since 1879. Italy joins in because Italy's mad at France because France took all their northern territories in Africa. Remember all that imperialism we talked about? Well, in 1902, Italy and France are going to be friends again. Again, it gets very complicated. Then you have Triple Entente in 1907. The Russians, the French, and Great Britain are going to be BFFs. And it's also good to know the Balkan League was formed in 1912, and that was four different countries that come together. They have a war against the Ottoman Empire in 1912 to 1913. And then there's going to be the Second Balkan War in 1913. So it's just good to know there's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of fighting. It's a huge mess. You guys know about this, the causes of World War I, the M, the A, the I, and the N, and we're going to go over every single one. Of course, assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the spark that starts it all. But it's like the immediate spark. It's not, there was all these other events that culminated. So militarism. Blah. This is the mass production of weapons that, of course, is going to lead to an arms race. We've got machine guns, very powerful weapons. Don't worry, we'll have a activity that you can do, that you will be doing, that will go over these in more detail. We have long-range artillery, tanks, which is a big deal. Side story, one of my grandfathers actually helped build the tanks in World War II because he was too young to fight in World War I. Airplanes and zeppelins, poison gas, mustard and chlorine. If you've seen Wonder Woman, you have some general idea. And the U-boats, we've got the German military submarines of World War I and World War II. So this new tech is going to be a big deal. This is going to increase the wartime casualties. And we have all of these different alliances. Please refer back, of course, to that slide 20 when I went over the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Here we go. We've got the Allies versus the Central Powers. The Allies were Great Britain, France, and Russia. They're going to drop out in 1917. Of course, the U.S. is going to join, and Italy and Japan. Of course, the Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. I know I have a picture here about the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. Just so you know, this happens in Turkey. The Triple Entente want to weaken the Ottoman by taking control of a strait that actually gets the supplies to the Russians. The Ottoman victory was after 8 months of fighting. So the Ottomans actually did have a victory there. Imperialism. This was our last unit. Please go back and review all your notes, but this will lead to intense competition for all the resources. This is why imperialism is so important. And then nationalism. This will increase the success of industrialization and imperialism. So there were these multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and they're going to experience these nationalistic tensions. Have all these people, like we talked about the Slavic people. They wanted to have their own nation, and instead they're getting pushed around. So the Balkans area is known as the powder keg of Europe. So, like I said, the Slavic people, they sought independence of the Ottomans and the Austrian-Hungarian empires. But, the Balkan Peninsula was also seen as unstable because all these different countries are going to start to break apart. So, the spark. We've talked about this. You've talked about this. Many of you guys have said, oh, well, I know it's the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand. He's assassinated by the Serbian Gavrilo Principe. The Black Hand, we've talked about it. I just briefly mentioned it. And of course, Austria-Hungary is going to issue this ultimatum to Serbia, turn over the conspirators, or you're going to go to war. Serbia, though, is going to decline the ultimatum. So Austria-Hungary is going to declare war on Serbia. Now, Russia has a large population of Slavic people, and they're an ally of Serbia. There's some other things too. There was two factions in Serbia. The country is near bankrupt in May of 1914, and they have heavy casualties due to those Balkan wars. So Russia wants peace in the Balkan region. So they're like, hey, Serbia, we got you. We're going to help you. So Russia's going to move troops to the Austrian border. Now we've got what is known as the July Crisis. You can see here in red is the Triple Alliance, and blue is the Triple Entente, and the yellowish mustard color is everyone that seems to be very neutral. Here we go. Russia is going to mobilize for war to protect Serbia. So on July 28, 1914, Serbia declines the ultimatum. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia and its ally Russia. And on August 1st, 1914, Germany declares war on Russia, because of course they did. But on August 3rd, they declare war on France. So they're going after both of their neighbors here. And August 4th, 1914, England declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy's going to back out. Remember, they were hanging out with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the 1800s, but then in 1902, they become friends with France, and they're like, guys, I got to get out of this. So they're going to go hang out with the blue guys. World War I begins. This is why it's known as a Great War, because it's basically more than one country. If it's two countries are fighting, that's a war. But if it's, several countries, that's when it becomes a world war. So now we have what is known as the Schlieffen Plan, which I'm totally butchering that. Germany is going to face a two-front war. The Schlieffen Plan was named after the chief of the German General Staff. This was an attack on France once Russia had mobilized her forces on the German border. This is actually going to lead to Britain declaring war on Germany on August 4th, 1914. Here's the issue. Schlieffen, this guy, he thought it would take Russia 6 weeks to mobilize. He assumed that Britain wouldn't even step in, but they did because they want to help Belgium. It's just how it works. Russia wants to help Serbs, Britain wants to help Belgium. Ultimately fails, and of course it results in a two-front war. Germany goes to the east, and they go to the west, and they're having to fight on both ends. The Western Front here is a 400-plus mile stretch of land that weaves through France and Belgium from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And we'll have some pictures in a second, but it's good to see here what their trench warfare was. Some of you are very familiar with this, some of you aren't, but you will get very familiar with this. So the A here is your front line trench, and on the B you have the support trench, And the C in the back is the reserve trench. The D, of course, is the enemy trench. So you have what is known as no man's land. It's like 25 yards to a mile wide. You've got barbed wire entanglements, and you didn't put your head above unless you're going to fight. But people would live in these areas. This is where you had to live. There were dugouts. This is where they fought their wars. Of course, you've got that movie out now called 1917. It's very realistic. But if you popped your head up, you could get hit with a bullet and die. So here's a nice little map of the Western Front. If you wanted to check that one out, of course, pause this, take some time to look it over. Soldiers, of course, going over the top into no man's land. It's a nice little picture here, and here's some pictures that are not going to be so nice. So if you have a weak stomach, good luck. Here we got a rat infestation in the land. You have gas attacks. They're wearing gas masks so you can see, because of course if the wind blows, they're going to get the gas. And this is known as trench foot. I mean, they are in these these muddy areas for months and months and months on end, and this was something that a lot of them had to deal with. Feel free to look that up on your own. All right, so we have the Western Front. It's going to become a stalemate, also known as a war of attrition. This means that attempts to win a war by wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse, and essentially whoever has the most resources at the end wins. So yay. Ugh. All right. We also have the Eastern Front. We remember this from our last units. Russia was less industrialized. They struggled to produce the weapons. And in the end, like 1.7 to 2.2 million will die in 3 years. And by 1917, Russia is on the brink of collapse because of that wonderful Russian Revolution, which you can refer back to slide 14 to go over that. Now, US gets involved. They were an isolationist. And of course, there are two events that will change that. You hear this a lot in history classes, that the sinking of the Lusitania is like this huge event that's going to bring the United States in. Here are some facts. The RMS Lusitania was a British ocean liner that was sunk by a German U-boat off of the coast of Ireland. 128 Americans died, and it was sad. The Americans said, "How could you do this? This was a passenger ship." And the Germans were like, "No, you were shipping weapons." And the Americans were like, "No, no, 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 we would never do that. We're not in the war." The truth was they were shipping weapons. They had been doing it prior to this date, and they ended up doing it after too, even though they said, "No, no, no, we won't do it again." But they did it. This ship sank in 1915. America doesn't join the war until 1917. So to say the Lusitania is the reason that America joined the war is not true. Okay? It may have been something to make people mad, but we didn't join the war for another 2 years. The Zimmerman telegram, on the other hand, that was enough to really spark that fire underneath our butts. So Germany sends a secret diplomatic communication to Mexico that essentially says, hey, why don't you guys attack the United States for that land? Remember, they took all that land from you? You need to go back and get it back. And what will happen is when we start doing better, we will help you. We will come back over there. We will help you get all that land back. Problem was, the British they intercepted this letter, and they managed to decode it, get it to the United States, and the United States declares war on Germany. Because their point was, look, we were cool, we were chill, we were over here. We may have been sending over some guns and stuff. You would have done the same thing. But you basically told another nation to declare war on us. That's a problem. So the sinking of the Lusitania, no, that's not the spark. The Zimmerman telegram, yes, yes it is. So the arrival of the American soldiers, of course, in 1918 is going to give a boost to the Allies. The war is going to end really soon right after. November 11, 1918, Germany agrees to an armistice, ceasefire, and World War I comes to an end. This is the first total war. That's why, of course, we didn't call it World War One at the time. We didn't think there would ever be another one. We just called it the Great War. There's propaganda, there's art, and there's media that's used to mobilize the population towards the war, that everyone should have been a part of this huge war effort. Even the colonies were expected to take part in this. The consequences of the war, though. So in April 1915 to 1917, there was an event called the Armenian Genocide, which does not get as much attention. It's getting more today, but when I went to high school, I didn't learn about it. This is when the Ottomans killed any able-bodied men, or they would send them to the military, but only to do forced labor. And then what they would do is then they would deport the women, the elderly, and the children on what are known as death marches through the Syrian desert. They were deprived of food and water. They were subjected to robbery, rape, and massacre. Anyone that could escape, what resulted with that were many diasporic communities that are around today. The Armenians were minority Christians in this empire, and they were accused of cooperating with the Russians. Anywhere from 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenians were killed during this time. Another consequence was the Spanish flu, which is actually the H1N1 virus. This infected 27% of the world's population. We actually don't know how many people died. It could be anywhere from 40 to 50 million or upwards of 100 million people. The reason we don't know is that any countries that were at war did not report what was happening, because they thought if we report this, this will make people panic and they won't go out there and work. They won't go out there and help us with the war effort. They won't create the bullets. They won't help create the guns. They won't help create everything we need to fight the bad guys in this war. Um, some people used to think that maybe this virus was so deadly and that's why so many people died, but now we know it probably has a lot more to do with malnourishment, sorry about that, overcrowded hospitals, medical camps, and poor hygiene at the time that essentially helped the H1N1 virus spread so quickly. We also have what is known as a lost generation. There were so many people who were suffering from the shock of war. This was a really hard war. This probably was the first time we had PTSD, because so many people were involved, and it really took its toll on people. And we all know the Treaty of Versailles. Germany loses its colonial empire and 15% of its European territory. They are forced to pay reparations. Their military force was restricted, and they were essentially told, you will take sole responsibility for the war. They didn't they weren't the ones who shot the bullet. They weren't the ones who did everything. Yeah, they may have started saying, hey, we're going to fight you, we're going to fight you, we're going to fight you, but it didn't essentially really start the war. So this is going to start a lot of anger and resentment that will build up for the next war. Lastly, Woodrow Wilson's can present what is known as the 14 points for peace, not for punishment. So while the European powers wanted revenge, he wanted to have peace. And of course, Japan and Italy are ignored in the whole Treaty of Versailles. So this is essentially it. We're up to 1919. We've got 40 or some odd slides to go, but we're going to pause here. I hope this helps you on the beginning. You really need to get a really good gist of what's going on. We have a lot to cover and not a lot of days to cover it in, so hopefully this helped. If you have any questions, you know where to find us. Have a great day.